It's also, as I said, however, a period in which we have seen the emergence of new growth poles. I think Professor Valadao reduced the strong economies to the BRICS. I guess I might even be a bit more bold and take out Brazil from that triumvirate, as I'm not quite convinced that the Brazilian economy has performed quite so well over the course of the last 2 decades as lumping it with India and China might suggest. But there is little doubt that India and China have performed remarkably well over the course of the last couple of decades. If you do a simple exercise, actually, if you take, and it's an interesting exercise which gives you a sense of the unevenness of the development process over the last 2 or 3 decades. If you take the growth performance of developing countries in the 1970s and you project that for the next 30 years, that is, we would look at where countries would be, developing countries, if they'd continued the trend that they were in the 1970s, there are essentially only 2 countries that would be better off: India and China. If you take Brazil's growth performance in the 70s and project it 30 years hence, it would be a much bigger player today than it actually is in the global economy. And that goes for just about every other region in the developing world too. So much of the talk about the rise of the South, I think, stems not so much from a long-term historical perspective, but a very strong fixation on what has been happening over the course of the last decade, in particular, and I think you have to admit that the last decade has had a number of features that have been very beneficial to developing countries: the scale of capital flows, the openness, the continuing openness of markets, the increasing role of foreign direct investment, and to some extent the technology that investment brings with it, although that tends to be oversold in most conventional accounts of the development process. But that has been a feature of the last couple of decades, and in particular the increase in commodity prices over the last decade has meant that you have had a global environment that has been essentially beneficial to many developing countries. And when people say they want to go back to business as usual, it's that, including many developing countries, that's the environment that they want to go back to. The problem, at least, the challenge, at least, for someone coming at this issue from the UNCTAD perspective, is that we do not believe that kind of global environment is going to come back. It's not an accident that it collapsed in 2008 and 2009, and it is very unlikely that the kind of global context in which many countries many developing countries enjoyed a very strong spurt of growth is going to return. Now, in that context, one of the features that accompanied the rise of developing countries, certainly over the last 10 years, has undoubtedly been an increase in economic ties amongst developing countries. Trade flow, whatever measure, at least on trade flows and investment flows, that has certainly been the case. It's less true if you look at other forms of capital flows. It's also true of movement of labor. So there has been a real increase in the links amongst developing countries over the course of the last 10 years. The problem is, as Professor Valadao rightly suggested, that is not because the engines of growth within the South have decoupled their growth experience from what has been happening in the advanced countries. In many respects, over this period, the leading developing countries have actually become more dependent upon growth and development in the North than was true of the previous 2 or 3 decades. If that environment has now fundamentally changed, and we believe in UNCTAD that it has fundamentally changed, then there is a real challenge for developing countries about how they can sustain the kind of growth that they enjoyed over the last decade, and saw them close income and economic gaps with the South over the subsequent 3, 4, or 5 decades hence. And that, I guess, is the challenge that's the challenge that UNCTAD is interested. It's a challenge, as Branislav said, that interests the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and they have an answer to that, how that growth performance could be sustained. It is very much the business as usual response. They think that developing countries, and particularly the big developing countries, should do more trade liberalization, more financial liberalization, should go out on a limb to attract more foreign direct investment, should tighten its intellectual property laws, should commit itself to the kinds of negotiations that you see in the WTO and Durban and elsewhere, to what Bob Zoellick seems to believe is a more responsible attitude by developing countries in the multilateral sphere. That's not the kind of policy response that UNCTAD believes is appropriate. Indeed, we do strongly believe if developing countries, the big developing countries in particular, are forced down that route, then the chances are that, as it did for the advanced countries, it will end very badly for the developing countries too. And in that context, in the discussions that UNCTAD is now having about UNCTAD 13, we have made a very strong case that at the national, at the regional and the international level, there needs to be a fundamental structural transformation away from finance-driven globalization towards what we have been calling in UNCTAD 13 development-led globalization. And I don't want to go into the details of that. We have the Secretary General's report that tries to spell that out, what we understand by that in some detail. Only to say, in terms of trying to just wrap up these thoughts, that much of the shift towards development-led globalization is a very traditional development agenda. I think for most of us, development remains fundamentally a national project in an interdependent world. That's what the development agenda is about. Its nation states remain the focal point for development initiatives. And unless nation states are able to mobilize the resources, direct those resources in productive activities, to address the inequalities that hinder development prospects, that engage in the kind of innovative activities geared to their local conditions that can produce inclusive and sustainable outcomes, then the chances of building the chances of avoiding chaos and imperialism, which seem to be the two options that Professor Valadao had on the table, will not be very strong. So we need to think about how we get back to a kind of rebalanced global economy in which national economies have the kind of policy space that they need to undertake pro-growth macro policies, that undertake industrial policies, and that can bring together in a much more effective way the social and economic challenges that continue to plague most developing countries. That is the context, at least for us, that South-South cooperation can offer some real opportunities for developing countries, both emerging and LDCs. And for example, in our recent Least Developed Country report in UNCTAD, we have tried to make a very strong case of how you marry this kind of South-South cooperation to the need to build developmental states that are capable of strengthening the productive capacities of countries in agriculture and industry. And also, and we think it's a very important point that is coming back into fashion but needs to and deserves a much more serious look again, is the kind of regional arrangements that that Ambassador Navarro talked about. Developmental regionalism is, we believe, one of the necessary pillars of a kind of inclusive and sustainable development-led globalization. And South-South cooperation, if it is to contribute to a more balanced global economy, will have to plug into the agenda of developmental regionalism over the course of the next decade and beyond that. I'll leave it there, Barney. It was a bit rushed, I'm sorry.